The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was huge beyond imagination, with walls that stretched up so high they seemed to touch the stars themselves. The ceiling showed images of all the member worlds spinning slowly in their eternal dance around distant suns. Thousands of seats filled the curved rows where beings from across the galaxy sat waiting for the meeting to begin. Ambassador Hyan Wu walked slowly down the long path toward the speaking platform. His black uniform was simple, but clean, and his face showed no emotion as he passed row after row of alien delegates. The snake-like Vorthak hissed softly as he walked by, their red eyes following his every step. The crystal beings called Nethri remained perfectly still, like living statues made of blue. Lighting the highest seats sat the council leaders who had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Their faces showed confusion and anger because they could not understand why the humans had called this emergency meeting. The Alterian delegate Zex Hai leaned forward in his seat, his blue skin darker than usual with worry. Hyan Wu had served as Earth ambassador for 15 years and had seen every kind of alien politics imaginable. He had watched his own people die, protecting worlds that would later vote against human proposals. He had seen human soldiers called monsters for being too effective in battle, and then called weak for showing mercy to defeated enemies. The platform rose up from the floor as Hyan Wu stepped onto it, lifting him high above the crowd so everyone could see him clearly. The noise in the great hall slowly died down as thousands of eyes and sensors turned toward the lone human figure. The translation devices began humming softly as they prepared to change his words into hundreds of different languages. 300 years ago, humans had first joined the Galactic Council as the newest and smallest member species. Nobody had expected much from the strange bipedal creatures from the small blue world in the outer rim, but when the void creatures had first appeared, threatening to devour entire star systems, it was human courage and human genius that had driven them back. The void beings were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. They existed partially outside normal space and time, making them almost impossible to fight with conventional weapons. They could phase through solid matter, eat pure energy, and reproduce by consuming the life force of entire planets. The established alien civilizations had been helpless against them, but humans were different. Humans had grown up on a world where survival meant constant adaptation and creative problem-solving when faced with impossible enemies. Humans did not give up or run away. They studied the problem, found weaknesses, and created new weapons and tactics that others had never imagined. Admiral Jinho had been just a young captain when he first encountered the void creatures in the Kepler system. His ship had been the only survivor of a fleet of 50 vessels, but instead of retreating, he had spent 3 days studying the enemy movements and energy patterns. When he finally returned to Earth, he brought with him the first complete analysis of void creature behavior. The breakthrough had come from Dr. Yun Seo, who realized that the void beings were not truly evil, but were prisoners trapped between dimensions and driven mad by their existence. This understanding led to the development of phase weapons that could actually hurt the creatures and dimensional barriers that could contain them. For 3 centuries, human fleets had patrolled the galaxy, keeping the void creatures contained in the dead zones between star systems. Human soldiers had died by the millions protecting alien worlds that most humans had never even seen. Human scientists had worked day and night developing new technologies to keep the galaxy safe, but the aliens had never been grateful. They complained that human weapons were too dangerous. They said human soldiers were too violent in battle. They demanded that humans fight with restrictions and rules that made victory almost impossible. When humans won battles too easily, they were accused of being warmongers. When they showed mercy to enemies, they were called weak and foolish. The worst incident had happened just 2 years ago, when the void creatures had broken through the barriers around the Vorthak homeworld. The Vorthak military had been completely overwhelmed, and billions of snake-like beings faced extinction. Admiral Jinho had arrived with the human emergency fleet and managed to drive the creatures back, but the cost had been enormous. 20,000 human soldiers had died in the battle, and 3 entire ships had been lost when they rammed themselves into void creatures to protect Vorthak evacuation transports. The surviving humans had expected at least some recognition for their sacrifice, but instead the Vorthak government had filed complaints about human tactics being too reckless. The council had actually held hearings about whether humans should be allowed to continue their defense duties. The same beings whose lives had been saved by human sacrifice stood up and criticized the methods used to save them. They demanded that humans follow stricter rules and get permission before taking any major military actions. Hien Wu looked out over the assembled aliens and felt a deep sadness in his chest. These beings had no idea what it cost to keep them safe. They saw only the results, never the price that was paid in human blood and human tears. They complained about human methods while sleeping safely in their beds because humans stood watch. In the darkness, the decision had been made on Earth after months of debate. The human government had finally realized that they were not protecting allies but ungrateful children, who would never appreciate what was being done for them. The galaxy wanted to be safe but did not want to pay the price of safety or even acknowledge those who paid it for them now. It was time to deliver the message that would change everything. The Great Hall had fallen completely silent as thousands of beings waited to hear what the human ambassador would say. Some expected another request for resources or support. Others thought perhaps humans wanted to expand their territory. Hien Wu activated the speaking device and his voice rang out clear and strong. Across the enormous chamber, his words were simple, but they carried the weight of 3 centuries of frustration and sacrifice. The decision is final, he announced, and his voice carried to every corner of the Great Hall. Humanity withdraws from all galactic defense agreements effective immediately. We are recalling all our fleets from patrol duty and closing all military bases outside human space. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, angry hisses, and electronic squeals of distress. The Altarian representative Zexhai jumped to his feet, his blue skin now pale with shock. You cannot abandon your duties, he shouted. The Outer Rim threats will consume us. All other delegates began shouting questions and demands. How could humans leave their posts? What would happen to the defense networks who would protect the trade routes from void creature attacks? But Hien Wu had heard all these arguments before during the long debates on Earth for 300 years, he said, raising his voice above the noise. We have given you our blood, our technology, and our lives. We have watched our children die protecting worlds that vote against us. In every council session, we have been criticized, condemned, and questioned at every turn. The human delegation began to stand up one by one, their faces showing the same calm determination. Every human representative in the Great Hall rose to their feet and faced the crowd of alien delegates. The message was clear and unmistakable. We are done. Hien Wu continued, his voice now carrying a tone of finality that silenced the chamber. Your people have made it clear that you do not trust our methods or appreciate our sacrifice. Therefore, we are returning to our own space and leaving you to defend yourselves as you see fit. The aliens finally understood what they had lost. The guardians who had kept the galaxy safe for 3 centuries were walking away. The human delegates filed out of the chamber in perfect order, their heads held high and their backs straight. Behind them they left a chamber full of beings who were only now beginning to realize what they had thrown away. As the last human left the Great Hall, the lights seemed to dim slightly. And for the first time in 300 years, the galaxy was truly alone. The darkness beyond the stars was waiting, and there would be no one left to hold it back. 3 months had passed since the humans walked out of the Galactic Council chamber, and the first signs of disaster were already appearing. The mining colonies on Kepler 442 had stopped sending their daily reports 2 weeks ago, and now the silence from that system was becoming frightening. Council President Yel Nara stood in her private office looking out at the stars through the massive window that took up the entire wall. Her skin was pale green and covered in the intricate patterns that marked her as a member of the ruling class, but today those patterns seemed faded and dull with worry. The emergency reports kept coming in from across the galaxy. Systems that had been peaceful for centuries were sending distress signals. Trading ships were disappearing without a trace, and the automated defense stations that humans had built were going offline one by one. An Altarian investigation fleet had finally reached the Kepler system after a week of travel, but what they found there made even the bravest captains feel sick to their stomachs. The 3 mining colonies were gone, not destroyed, but completely erased. As If they had never existed at all, the debris field that remained was strange and wrong. Somehow the metal fragments were twisted into impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly, and the energy readings were unlike anything in the known databases. The sensors detected traces of void creature activity, but the patterns were different from what the old records showed. Captain Velfair commanded the investigation fleet, and he had seen combat before during the border wars with the hegemony, but this was something else entirely. The void creatures had evolved, somehow become more organized and more dangerous than they had been when humans kept them contained. The worst discovery came when they found the research station that had been monitoring the void barriers. The entire facility was intact, but every living being inside had been drained of life force, leaving only empty husks behind. The research computers showed that the barriers had been failing for months, but there had been no one to repair them. Back at the council headquarters, the emergency session was called, and delegates from across the galaxy gathered to hear the terrible news. The same beings who had celebrated when humans left now sat in stunned silence as the reports were read aloud. The void creatures were moving again, spreading out from their containment zones like a plague of darkness. The energy beings that humans had fought for 3 centuries were now free to hunt and feed across the galaxy, and there was no one left who knew how to stop them. Yell. Nara stood before the assembled delegates, her voice shaking slightly. As she spoke, the human fleets are gone, she announced, and the void barriers are failing. We estimate that we have perhaps 6 months before the creatures reach the core worlds. The reaction was immediate, and desperate delegates began shouting questions and demands. Some suggested trying to negotiate with the void creatures, while others wanted to evacuate entire star systems. The Vorthak representative demanded that Earth be contacted immediately to ask for help, but when the messages were sent to Earth, the responses were cold and formal. The new human foreign minister, so young, replied with the same message to every request. The Terran Federation wishes the Galactic Council well in their endeavors. We are no longer available for military consultation. The aliens had expected anger or demands for apologies, but the complete indifference was somehow worse. It was as if humanity had simply written off the entire galaxy and moved on to other concerns. The beings who had once criticized human methods now begged for those same methods to be used again. The void creatures struck again just 2 weeks later, this time hitting the Nethri crystal farms in the Andromeda sector. The Nethri were an ancient race of crystalline beings who communicated through telepathy and had some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy, but all their knowledge and power meant nothing against enemies that existed partially outside normal reality. The void creatures moved through the crystal matrices like they were made of empty space, consuming the pure energy that the Nethri used for both food and communication. The telepathic screams of the dying Nethri echoed across subspace, reaching every psychic sensitive being within 100 light years. The creatures were not just killing, they were feeding, growing stronger with each world they consumed on Earth. Admiral Jin Ho sat in his office at the Terran Defense Command, monitoring the reports that still came in through the intelligence networks. Humanity had not truly abandoned the galaxy. They still watched and listened, but they no longer acted. His aide, Captain Min Young, entered the office carrying the latest updates from the Outer Rim. Her face was pale and her hands shook slightly. As she placed the datapad on his desk, "Sir," she said quietly, "the casualty estimates are in the billions." Jin Ho looked at the numbers and felt a deep sadness in his chest. These were not just statistics, but real people, real lives that were being lost every day. The void creatures grew stronger and bolder, and every day more worlds fell silent. Alien governments were trying everything they could think of. The Vorthak sent their entire war fleet to engage the creatures in the Rigel system, but their weapons were useless against beings that could phase through solid matter. The proud snake warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds in the past were reduced to fleeing for their lives. The Alterian Science Council tried to reverse engineer the human phase weapons, but the technology was far beyond their understanding. The weapons required not just advanced materials, but a completely different way of thinking about space and time that only humans seem to possess. "Should we not help them?" Min Young asked quietly as she watched the casualty reports scroll across the screen. "They are dying out there, and we have the power to save them." Jin Ho was silent for a long moment as he considered her words. He had spent 50 years of his life fighting the void creatures, and he knew better than anyone what they were capable of. But he also remembered the countless times that human sacrifice had been criticized and condemned by the very beings they had saved. They made their choice. He said finally, when they refused to trust us, we cannot save those who do not wish to be saved. The galaxy wanted to be independent, and now they must face the consequences of that independence. The void creatures were learning and adapting with each victory. They began to coordinate their attacks, hitting multiple systems simultaneously and using tactics that showed a growing intelligence. The mindless predators that humans had contained for centuries were becoming something much more dangerous. The breaking point came when a massive swarm of void creatures appeared in the Centauri system, home to over 50 billion beings. The system defense fleet lasted exactly 37 minutes before being completely overwhelmed. The creatures then began systematically consuming every source of energy in the system. The evacuation was chaos as billions of beings tried to flee in ships that were never designed for such massive population movements. Entire families were separated in the panic, and many ships broke down under the strain of carrying far more passengers than they were built for. Last transmission from Centauri was from a human merchant captain named Tae-1, who had been trapped in the system when the attack began. His ship was one of the few vessels that managed to escape the initial assault, and he spent his final hours helping coordinate the evacuation efforts. This is Captain Tae-1 of the merchant vessel Bright. Hope he broadcast on all frequencies. We are the last ship leaving the system. All evacuation routes are compromised. The void creatures are everywhere. Tell Earth, tell everyone what happened here. The transmission cut off abruptly as the void creatures reached his ship, leaving only static and silence. The Centauri system, one of the oldest and most prosperous in the galaxy, was now a dead zone filled with nothing but hungry darkness. The news of Centauri fall reached Earth within hours, and the reaction was immediate and intense. The human population was outraged that their former allies had let such a catastrophe happen. Many demanded that the government take action, while others insisted that the aliens deserved what they were getting. President Soo-jin called an emergency cabinet meeting as protests erupted in cities across Earth. The weight of decision lay heavy on her shoulders as she faced the impossible choice between justice and mercy. The galaxy had cast humanity out, but they were still people, still lives that mattered. The void creatures were spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and soon they would reach the core worlds where trillions of beings lived in the false safety of their advanced civilizations. The darkness that humans had held back for 3 centuries was finally free, and it was hungry. The proud Vorthic Empire had ruled over 200 star systems for 800 years, but now their mighty fleets were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The snake-like warriors who had once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies were now the ones running in terror. General Sekther stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display show red markers spreading across Vorthak space. Each marker represented a world that had been consumed by the void creatures, and there were more appearing every day. The Vorthik had tried everything they could think of to stop the creatures. Their plasma cannons, which could melt through the hull of any known ship, passed harmlessly through the void beings. Their famous boarding tactics were useless against enemies that could drain the life force from a warrior with a single touch. We cannot fight them with conventional weapons, Sekther said to his officers as another system fell. The creatures exist partially outside our reality, and our weapons simply cannot reach them. We need the human phase technology, but we do not understand how it works. The Vorthik science cast had been trying for months to reverse engineer the human weapons left behind at abandoned defense stations, but the technology was beyond their comprehension. The weapons required materials that could only be created in specialized facilities and manufacturing processes that no one else had ever developed. Meanwhile, the void creatures were spreading through Vorthik space like a plague. Each world they consumed made them stronger and more intelligent. The mindless predators that had once been contained were now showing signs of coordination and planning on Earth. Commander Min received the daily intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The human spy network was still active even though the military had been withdrawn, and the information they gathered painted a picture of complete disaster. The Alterian homeworld was under siege, with billions of blue-skinned beings evacuating their cities as reality itself began to tear apart around them. The void creatures had learned to attack the very fabric of space-time, creating impossible geometries that drove people insane just by looking at them. The Alterian fleet had been the pride of their civilization, with ships that could travel between dimensions and weapons that could manipulate gravity itself, but against the void creatures they might as well have been throwing rocks. Their most advanced warships lasted an average of 20 minutes in direct combat. The survivors sent desperate messages to Earth begging for help and offering everything they had in exchange for human assistance. We were wrong. They transmitted, "We understand now that we needed you. Please forgive us and help us save our people." But the messages went unanswered. Earth had closed its borders and recalled all its citizens from alien space. The humans who had once died protecting alien worlds now watched from afar as those same worlds burned. The Nethri crystal beings tried a different approach. They attempted to communicate with the void creatures using their advanced telepathic abilities, hoping to understand what the creatures wanted, but the contact was disastrous. The void beings' minds were so alien and chaotic that several Nethri telepaths went insane from the brief contact. The creatures did not want territory or resources. They wanted to feed on the life force and energy of living beings. They were like a cosmic hurricane that consumed everything in its path and could not be reasoned with or bargained with. President Sujin sat in the secure briefing room deep beneath the Earth Defense Command, reading the latest reports from the intelligence services. The casualty numbers were staggering. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were being wiped out in a matter of days. "They cast us out," she said quietly to her advisors, "but they are still people, still lives that matter. We cannot simply stand by and watch genocide happen, even if those being killed once betrayed us." But the political situation on Earth was complicated. Many humans felt that the aliens deserved what they were getting after centuries of ingratitude and criticism. The families of soldiers who had died protecting alien worlds were especially bitter about the idea of helping their former allies. The void creatures reached the core worlds sooner than anyone had expected. They bypassed the heavily defended systems and struck directly at the heart of galactic civilization. The ancient world of Nexus Prime, where the first interstellar government had been formed, was consumed in a matter of hours. The beings who lived there had records going back 50,000 years and libraries that contained the knowledge of 100 different species, but none of that mattered. When the void creatures arrived, the planet was drained of all life and energy, leaving behind nothing but a cold, dead rock. The psychological impact was devastating. Nexus Prime had been considered the most secure world in the galaxy, protected by layer after layer of defenses and shields. If the void creatures could reach there, then nowhere was safe. The refugee crisis was becoming impossible to manage. Trillions of beings were fleeing toward the galactic center, creating massive traffic jams in the hyperspace lanes. Many ships broke down under the strain of carrying far more passengers than they were designed for. Human border patrol ship Indomitable, commanded by Captain Dong Haiyan, encountered the first major refugee fleet at the edge of human space. Hundreds of ships filled with desperate aliens approached the border, seeking sanctuary in the one place that might still be safe. The aliens who had once voted to restrict human expansion and criticized human policies now begged for permission to enter human territory. Many of them were injured and sick, and all of them were terrified of the darkness that was consuming their homes. Captain Dong Haiyan looked at the refugee fleet through his view screen and thought of his own daughter safe on Earth. These alien children had done nothing wrong. They were paying the price for their leaders' mistakes and poor decisions. Opened the channels. He ordered his communications officer, "All ships, you are cleared for humanitarian passage. Welcome to human space." Sometimes being human meant doing what was right, even when it hurt. The refugee camps on human border worlds quickly became overcrowded as more and more aliens arrived seeking safety. The humans who ran these camps worked day and night to provide food, medical care, and shelter for beings from dozens of different species. But the void creatures were not finished with their assault. They had learned from their victories and were becoming more sophisticated in their attacks. They began to target the infrastructure that held galactic civilization together. The hyperspace beacons that allowed faster-than-light travel were destroyed one by one, cutting off communication and trade between star systems. The energy networks that powered entire worlds were consumed, leaving billions of beings in darkness. The banking systems that managed galactic commerce collapsed as the computer networks that ran them were drained of power. The carefully maintained supply chains that brought food and resources to populated worlds broke down completely. Dr. UNESCO worked frantically in her laboratory on Earth, trying to understand how the void creatures had evolved so quickly. Her research showed that they were not just feeding on energy, but learning from it. Each world they consumed gave them new knowledge and abilities. The creatures that had once been simple predators were now showing signs of strategic thinking. They were targeting the most important systems first and avoiding areas where they might face organized resistance. The worst part was that they were adapting to the few remaining human weapons that other species had managed to acquire. The phase shields that had once provided protection were becoming less effective as the creatures learned to work around them. The galaxy was dying, and there seemed to be no way to stop the destruction. The great civilizations that had ruled the stars for thousands of years were being reduced to scattered refugees hiding in the few remaining safe zones. But in the depths of human space, something was stirring. The shipyards of Mars and Europa that had been quiet for months were suddenly roaring back to life. The humans who had withdrawn from galactic affairs were preparing for something big. The void creatures had made one crucial mistake. In their conquest of the galaxy, they had given humanity time to prepare, and humans were very good at learning from their mistakes. The Guardians were getting ready to return, but this time they would do things differently. The great Galactic Council building stood empty and dark, its massive halls echoing with the sound of automated systems slowly shutting down. The maintenance crews had fled weeks ago when the void creatures reached the outer districts, and now the symbol of galactic unity was becoming a Tomb Council president. Yelnara sat alone in her private office, staring at the evacuation orders that covered her desk. The government that had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years was collapsing as member worlds abandoned their posts and fled deeper into the core systems. The communication networks were failing as more relay stations were consumed by the void creatures. Messages that once traveled across the galaxy in hours now took days to reach their destinations. If they arrived at all, the carefully maintained web of information that held civilization together was unraveling. In the abandoned council chambers, the great displays that had once shown the locations of every member world now showed only darkness spreading like ink through water. The void creatures had consumed entire sectors and showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. UNESCO stood in her laboratory on Earth, surrounded by holographic displays showing the spread of void creatures across the galaxy. Her research team had been working for months without rest, trying to understand how the situation had deteriorated so quickly. The containment barriers we built are failing, she explained to the assembled human leadership. Her voice was strained from months of sleepless nights and constant worry. Without constant maintenance and reinforcement, the void will consume the entire galaxy within 2 years. The implications were staggering. Even Earth, with its advanced defenses and hidden location, would eventually fall to the spreading darkness. The humans who had withdrawn from galactic affairs to save themselves were realizing that there was no escape from this threat. The void creatures had evolved beyond anything the galaxy had faced before. They were no longer just consuming energy and matter, but were actually learning to manipulate the fabric of space and time itself. The barriers between dimensions were weakening and reality was becoming unstable. General Kyung-ho reviewed the tactical reports from the intelligence networks, and the picture they painted was worse than anyone had imagined. The void creatures were not just spreading randomly, but were following a pattern, targeting the most important systems first. They had learned to recognize the signs of advanced civilization and were deliberately destroying the infrastructure that other species needed to survive. The hyperlanes that connected star systems were being severed one by one, cutting off trade and communication. The manufacturing worlds that produced the technology needed for modern life were being consumed along with their knowledge and industrial capacity. The university planets where the greatest minds of the galaxy had gathered were now silent void zones, but the most disturbing discovery was that the void creatures were beginning to work together in ways that suggested a growing intelligence. They were coordinating their attacks and sharing information across vast distances, using methods that human scientists could barely comprehend. The refugee situation was becoming desperate as millions of beings arrived at the borders of human space every day. The camps on human worlds were overcrowded and running out of supplies. But the flow of desperate aliens showed no signs of stopping. Many of the refugees were former government officials and military officers who had once criticized human methods and voted against human proposals. Now they came as beggars seeking protection from the very people they had scorned. Ambassador Han Wu visited the refugee camps on the border world of New Seoul and was struck by the change in the aliens he met. The proud Vorthok generals who had once demanded that humans fight with restrictions were now broken and defeated, their mighty empire reduced to a few scattered survivors. The Alterian scientists who had questioned human research methods now desperately sought human knowledge, hoping to find some way to fight back against the void creatures, but the technology they needed required not just information but a completely different way of thinking about reality. The Nethri crystal beings who had once claimed superiority over human telepaths were now barely functional. Their crystalline minds had been damaged by contact with the void creatures, and they existed in a state of constant fear and confusion. But there were also ordinary families who had done nothing wrong, children who had never voted against humanity or criticized human policies. They were innocent victims of their leaders' mistakes, and they deserved protection regardless of past grievances. Captain Dong Haiyan continued to patrol the border zones, helping to process the endless stream of refugees whose crew worked around the clock to provide aid and comfort to beings from dozens of different species. Many of the aliens had never seen humans before and were surprised by their kindness. The human border guards who had once been trained to keep aliens out now found themselves welcoming desperate refugees and providing emergency medical care. The irony was not lost on anyone that the beings who had once restricted human expansion now depended on human mercy for survival on Earth. The political debate raged as the government tried to decide how to respond to the crisis. Many humans wanted to help the refugees, but were reluctant to risk human lives for beings who had betrayed them. Others argued that humanity had a moral obligation to protect innocent life. The families of soldiers who had died protecting alien worlds were divided. Some wanted revenge for the ingratitude they had experienced, while others believed that their loved ones would have wanted them to help regardless of past wrongs. President Su Jin faced the most difficult decision of her career as she weighed the demands of justice against the requirements of mercy. The galaxy that had rejected humanity was now dying, and only human intervention could save it, but the cost would be enormous. The void creatures were stronger than ever, and fighting them would require sacrifices that would make the previous 3 centuries of warfare look small by comparison. Thousands of human ships and millions of human lives would be needed to have any chance of success. The intelligence reports showed that the void creatures were massing for a final assault on the galactic core where the last major civilizations were making their stand. The ancient worlds that had been the centers of learning and culture for thousands of years were about to fall. Defense fleets that remained were a mixture of species that had never worked together before and had no common command structure or communication protocols. They were brave but doomed, facing an enemy that had evolved beyond their ability to fight the human military. Analysts estimated that the remaining alien forces would last no more than 6 months against the coordinated void assault. After that, the creatures would be free to spread through the galaxy, consuming everything in their path. But something was happening in the depths of human space that gave hope to those who knew how to look for it. The great shipyards that had been quiet since the withdrawal were suddenly alive with activity. New designs were being tested and new weapons were being manufactured. The soldiers who had spent their careers fighting the void creatures were being recalled to active duty, and new recruits were being trained in tactics that had never been used before. The human war machine was awakening from its slumber and preparing for the greatest battle in galactic History Admiral Jin Ho stood on the observation deck of the Mars Orbital Shipyard watching the construction of vessels unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. These were not just warships, but tools designed for a specific purpose, ending the void threat once and for all. The question was not whether humanity could save the galaxy, but whether the galaxy deserved to be saved. The beings who had driven away their protectors were now paying the price for their pride and stubbornness. But as Jin Ho watched human workers building ships that would carry them into battle against impossible odds, he realized that the answer had already been decided. Humanity would fight not because they owed the galaxy anything, but because it was the right thing to. The Guardians were returning, but this time they would do so on their own terms. The galaxy would be saved, but it would also learn a lesson about the true cost of freedom and the price of rejecting those who stand watch in the darkness. The void creatures had evolved into something that defied all previous understanding of what they were supposed to be. The energy beings that had once been simple predators driven by hunger were now showing signs of complex thought and strategic planning. Dr. Yun Seo stood before the holographic display in her laboratory, studying the latest intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The patterns of void creature movement were no longer random, but showed clear signs of coordination and purpose. They are learning, she explained to the assembled human leadership, pointing to the tactical maps that showed void creature positions. They are not just consuming energy anymore, but are actually studying the civilizations they encounter. The implications were terrifying. The void creatures were adapting to every defense that the remaining alien forces could mount. They had learned to recognize the signatures of different weapons and were developing countermeasures faster than new tactics could be deployed. Each world they consumed gave them new knowledge about technology, warfare, and even the psychology of the beings they fought. The creatures that had once been content to simply feed were now actively hunting the most advanced civilizations. First, the attack on the hegemony capital world had been a perfect example of this new intelligence. The void creatures had bypassed the heavily defended outer systems and struck directly at the government center using tactics that showed detailed knowledge of hegemony military doctrine. They had attacked during the changing of the guard, when the defense fleet was rotating shifts, and had targeted the specific weak points in the planetary shield network. The assault had been so precisely timed that it could only have been planned by beings with intimate knowledge of hegemony procedures. But the most disturbing aspect was that the void creatures were beginning to communicate with each other across vast distances using methods that human scientists could barely detect. The isolated predators of the past had become a coordinated swarm. Intelligence on Earth. General Kyung Ho assembled the greatest collection of military minds that humanity had ever gathered in one place. Veterans of the Void Wars, scientists who had spent decades studying the enemy, and strategists who had kept the galaxy safe for 3 centuries. The conference room in the underground command center was filled with the most experienced officers in human history. People who had fought battles that others could not even imagine, and had faced impossible odds and won through courage and ingenuity. The task before them was unprecedented. They had to save a galaxy that had rejected them from an enemy that had evolved beyond anything they had faced before. The void creatures were no longer just a threat to individual worlds, but to the very concept of organized civilization. We have a choice, General Kyung Ho said as he addressed the assembled officers. We can stay safe behind our barriers and watch the galaxy die, or we can remember why we became guardians in the first place. The room fell silent as each person considered the magnitude of what was being asked. They had been betrayed by the very people they had protected, criticized for their methods, and abandoned when their sacrifice was no longer convenient. But they were still human, and humans had always stood up to protect life, even when it was difficult or thankless. The principle that had driven them to become guardians in the first place had not changed, even if the galaxy had turned against them. Intelligence reports showed that the void creatures were massing for a final assault on the galactic core, where the last major civilizations were making their desperate stand. The ancient worlds that had been centers of learning and culture for thousands of years were about to fall. The Alterian homeworld was surrounded by a swarm of void creatures that grew larger every They, the blue-skinned beings who had once been among the most advanced in the galaxy, were now trapped on their own planet watching reality. Tear apart around them, the Nethri crystal farms that had produced the pure energy needed for their civilization were being systematically destroyed. The telepathic beings who had once claimed to understand the universe better than anyone else were now being driven insane by contact with alien minds. The last Vorthak fleet had made a final stand at the edge of their home system, but had been overwhelmed by void creatures that seemed to anticipate their every move. The proud warrior race that had conquered hundreds of worlds was now extinct. The refugee camps in human space were overcrowded with millions of beings who had lost everything they had ever known. Many of them were the last survivors of entire species that had existed for thousands of years, but something else was happening in the depths of human space that gave hope to those who knew how to recognize it. The great shipyards of Mars Europa and the outer colonies were working at full capacity, producing vessels designed for a specific purpose. The ships that emerged from these facilities were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. They incorporated 3 centuries of experience fighting void creatures combined with new technologies that had been developed during the months of human withdrawal. Admiral Jin Ho stood on the bridge of the new flagship Eternal Vigil, watching the final preparations for the greatest military operation in galactic history. The ship was not just a warship, but a mobile command center designed to coordinate the actions of thousands of vessels across multiple star systems. The human fleet that was assembling was smaller than the armadas that had once patrolled the galaxy, but it was far more advanced. Every ship was equipped with the latest phase weapons and dimensional shields that could protect against void creature attacks, but the real breakthrough had come from Dr. Yunesio research into the nature of the void creatures themselves. Her team had discovered that the beings were not actually evil invaders, but were prisoners trapped between dimensions and driven mad by their existence. The void creatures are not our enemies, she explained to the fleet commanders in a secure briefing. They are victims of a cosmic accident that happened millions of years ago. They are trapped in a state of existence that causes them constant pain and drives them to seek release through consumption. This discovery changed everything about how humans approach the problem. Instead of simply trying to destroy the void creatures, the goal became finding a way to send them back to their home dimension where they could exist in peace. It was a typically human solution to turn enemies into beings that could be saved rather than destroyed. The same empathy that had driven humans to protect alien civilizations for 3 centuries was now being applied to the creatures that threatened those civilizations. The plan that emerged from months of preparation was ambitious beyond anything that had been attempted before. Human fleets would have to penetrate deep into void creature territory and establish dimensional anchor points that could open a permanent gateway. The risks were enormous. The void creatures were at their strongest, now fed by the energy of dozens of consumed worlds and organized into a coordinated intelligence that could anticipate and counter human tactics. But the human military had learned from 3 centuries of void warfare and had developed new approaches that took advantage of the creatures' evolved intelligence. The very fact that they were now organized and predictable made them vulnerable to strategies that had never been tried before. The alien refugees in human space watched the preparations with growing hope and amazement. The humans who had been driven away by ingratitude and criticism were preparing to risk everything to save beings who had betrayed them. Many of the refugees volunteered to help in whatever way they could, offering their knowledge of void creature behavior and their expertise in technologies that might be useful. The same beings who had once questioned human methods now worked alongside human scientists and engineers. The final preparations were completed in the depths of space, far from any inhabited world, where the human fleet gathered for the greatest battle in galactic history. Ships that had been built in secret during the months of withdrawal now revealed themselves as the most advanced vessels ever created. Admiral Jin Ho looked out at the assembled fleet and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the courage and dedication of the humans who had volunteered for this mission, and sadness for the price that would have to be paid. The void creatures were waiting in the galactic core where they had gathered for their final assault on The last bastions of civilization, the battle that was about to begin, would determine whether the galaxy lived or died. As Jin Ho watched his crews make their final preparations, he knew that regardless of the outcome, humanity had already won. The most important victory, they had chosen to do what was right, even when it was hard, even when those they protected had turned against them. The Guardians were returning not because they had to, but because they chose to. The galaxy would learn once again what it meant to have humans standing watch in the darkness, but this time the lesson would not be forgotten. The human fleet that emerged from the hyperspace jump at the edge of the galactic core was unlike anything that had ever been seen before. Ships that seemed to bend light around them moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with energy. Fields that made them look like living stars. Admiral Jin Ho stood on the bridge of the flagship Eternal Vigil, watching the tactical displays show the positions of over 10,000 human vessels. The fleet represented the combined effort of every human world and contained technologies that had been developed during the months of withdrawal. 3 centuries of experience fighting void creatures had been compressed into these ships, along with innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The vessels could phase through void attacks, exist partially outside normal space, and coordinate their actions across vast distances. But this was not just about military might. The breakthrough that Dr. Yoon Seo had made about the true nature of the void creatures had changed everything about how humans approach the problem. Instead of simply trying to destroy the creatures, the goal was to save them. The void creatures are not invaders, she had explained to the fleet commanders during the final briefing. They are prisoners, beings that were trapped between dimensions millions of years ago and driven mad by their existence. We can send them home. The dimensional gateway device that had been constructed was the most complex piece of technology ever created by humanity. It required the coordinated efforts of thousands of ships working together to open a stable portal between dimensions. The void creatures had gathered at the galactic core for their final assault on the last remaining civilizations. Trillions of the energy beings swirled around the ancient worlds, like a dark storm preparing to consume everything that remained of galactic civilization. The battle began as human ships moved into position around the core systems. The void creatures immediately responded to the human presence, recognizing the threat that the returning Guardians represented. But the humans were ready for them. The new phase weapons could actually wound the energy beings, while the dimensional shields could deflect their attacks. The ships moved like dancers through space, avoiding the void creatures' attempts to drain their energy. Captain Min Young commanded a squadron of fast attack ships that darted between the void creatures, disrupting their formations and preventing them from coordinating their attacks. Her crews had trained for months for this moment, and they executed their maneuvers with perfect precision. The void creatures tried to adapt to the human tactics, but found themselves facing strategies they had never encountered before. The humans were not just fighting to destroy, but were herding the creatures towards specific locations where the dimensional gateway could be opened. Dr. Yoon Seo worked frantically in the science section of the flagship, monitoring the dimensional readings as the gateway device began to charge. The energy requirements were enormous, drawing power from hundreds of ships. Simultaneously, the alien survivors on the core worlds watched in amazement as human ships danced through formations of void creatures that had previously been unstoppable. The same humans they had criticized for being too violent were now showing incredible precision and skill. The breakthrough came when the first group of void creatures began to respond to the dimensional signals. The beings that had been driven mad by their imprisonment between dimensions sensed the possibility of escape and began to move toward the gateway. It is working, Dr. Yoon Seo announced as the readings showed void creatures beginning to pass through the dimensional portal. They are going home. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years were finally being offered the peace they had been seeking, but the battle was far from over. The void creatures near the gateway were responding to the offer of freedom, but millions more were still scattered across the galaxy, still driven by hunger and pain to consume everything they encountered. Admiral Jin Ho ordered the fleet to advance deeper into the core systems where the largest concentrations of void creatures were located. The human ships moved in perfect coordination, their captains following battle plans that had been refined over centuries. of warfare, the Void creatures fought back with everything they had learned from their consumption of galactic civilization. They used tactics copied from Vorthok warriors' energy manipulation techniques, learned from the Altarian scientists, and telepathic attacks based on Nethri methods, but the humans had evolved too. During the months of withdrawal, they had developed countermeasures for every Void creature ability and had created new technologies that the creatures had never encountered before. The battle raged across dozens of star systems as human ships systematically cleared each area of Void creatures and guided them toward the dimensional gateways. The energy beings that had once been unstoppable predators were now being rescued by the very people they had threatened. The turning point came when the Void creatures began to communicate with each other, using the same coordination abilities that had made them so dangerous. The creatures that